Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Energy Markets podcast. It is the 11th of July, and it is Brent crude oil trading up today, up nearly three quarters of a percent at 85.69. That sort of spot a very tight range we've been in this week, really, 85 to 86 nearly. It seems that the market is captured in a happy place, really. WTI trading at 82.69. That's a nice, robust number for the US crude. Um, let's kick off this morning in the US, given what the outlook there with a very positive 4th of July weekend. Rachel Ziemba, adjunct fellow at the Center for a New American Security, senior advisor at Horizon Engage. Rachel, data in from the US, the 4th of July, the big holiday season, the
Mhm.
kickoff for the big bumper, let's go barbecue, have some fun, and aviation and gasoline looking very strong. Your thoughts on the outlook for US demand going forward?
Yeah, I see U.S. demand being relatively steady. We're seeing the U.S. economy chugging along, slowing down a bit, but still being supported by, Biden administration industrial policy, right? We also, I think, the other challenge on the sort of demand side will be something I'm sure that comes up a bit, which is this question mark about the impact of the hurricanes, and that's more of a supply side story. But I do think this sort of element of hoarding and other questions there. So I see the U.S. demand being relatively steady. And but that also ties into this fact that, of course, the Federal Reserve is not cutting interest rates anytime soon, at least in my view, right? Which has been one of our sort of narratives across the board. When I look across the world, and I'm sure Osama and Mark will have things to say about this, the really strong supporter of demand growth for oil right now is India, right? Sort of China has been sort of relatively stagnant. The U.S. demand has been holding up, and the like, but it's really India where we're seeing that demand growth.
Well, let's go to Mark Oswald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International. Mark, we do have a very important meeting next week in China, the third plenum of the Select Committee, essentially the top people in the Communist Party who decide everything, the top 200 people. They're having their third summit of this current 5-year government. The one in which, in historical terms, has always delivered some, fairly positive economic change, economic progress. Your thoughts and expectation for China to finally deliver on that stimulus package everybody's been waiting for?
Well, you certainly nailed that. It is this waiting for China to deliver something which is going to be significant. I think it was Premier Lee who basically suggested that there would be significant changes, as did President Xi. But we've heard this all before. So we're now, as we are in a certain sense with the UK government, where the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Actions speak louder than words. It's what I say, at the end of the day, the elephant in the room is the property sector. They've tried a lot of tinkering measures, but there's been nothing which has been even close to shock and awe. And it is about restoring consumer confidence. My personal feeling is that people looking for big spending plans probably are in the wrong place. Those, better directed spending would be a good idea. And there needs to be something which is more legislative to try and restore consumer confidence and indeed business confidence. That's really where the problems lie. And for the time being, that still seems a distant cry. You only have to look at the inflation numbers that we had earlier in the week. And as for the activity data, yeah, the year started off on a good note, but I think it's going to trail off as we've seen a lot of incoming data.
Osama Rizvi, energy and economic analyst at Primary Vision Network. Osama, we've seen the elections, the new president in Iran, we've got your India elections. Your two big neighbors have just elected their new governments, and Pakistan in the middle. Is this geopolitical stability? Is this economic new dawn for your near Asia community?
Well, Sean, I do not think so because we are all in the same boat, right? And if you look at the global economic outlook or the global economic indicators, the macro indicators, most of them are not really encouraging. This can be seen specifically when you talk about the Asian markets or on my side of the world. It's the Saudi Arab's recent oil exports hit a 10-month low. And according to Kepler, this was because of low Asian demand and, of course, high consumption, domestic consumption in the Middle East. But if you look at China, one of the largest consumers there, um, in the past 2 years, China had the lowest amount of super tankers heading to their country. Year-on-year basis, the seaborne oil imports reduced by 14%. We don't know, as we were discussing, what is Chinese demand going to look like for the rest of the year. So similarly, if you look around Iran, if you look around India, India has specifically in terms of the oil markets, it's doing something very interesting because if you look at the figures, India's oil imports from Russia increased by 1.97 million barrels per day, whereas overall from Saudi Arabia, the oil imports decreased. So maybe they're thinking about, reorient. Maybe they're thinking about a reorientation of their energy policy, which we will see in the longer run and the repercussions of it as well. But overall, things remain the same. We are all in the same boat, and we are all facing these economic challenges.
Rachel, this week we have the big NATO meeting in Washington being
Mhm.
hosted by President Biden. And we had a notable sort of line crossed yesterday, well, our yesterday, maybe still your today, but nonetheless, that NATO has finally made a declaration that China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. Your thoughts on that step? What does it signal for where this may go forward?
Sure. So I think it was so it was my yesterday. And the like. I've actually been spending this week in New York on the sidelines of the UN high level political forum where it's about a lot of other fragmentation issues and so on. So I do think this was an important step, and also an important step given some of the NATO members like Turkey and others also have been sort of important trading partners with Russia, though not on the military side. In terms of what it changes, I'm not sure that it sort of changes much on the sanctions, on the sanctions front. Many NATO members, the US, Canada, the European Union, Britain, have already been adding Chinese entities to their sanctions lists. We know it's very difficult for them to actually enforce export controls and limit in that area. The US has been expanding secondary sanctions threats on foreign banks, including Chinese ones, but has been quite reluctant to actually add any banks to the list. So I think they're really hoping that by using the collective will at NATO, by signaling to Chinese banks and Turkish banks and Emirati banks the risks of facilitating this trade, that these companies will and banks will cut back on that trade. But we do know that new shell companies develop. And I see Chinese entities being perhaps wary of direct support, but indirect support will continue. We've seen recently in the oil markets or the energy markets infrastructure down the line, some Chinese shipyards starting to become wary of support of Russian long-term LNG projects. And so I think we might continue to see a smaller subset of entities in China supporting Russia's war effort. But they will, in my mind, probably still continue to support Russia's war effort. We talk a lot on this podcast of the limitations of how far one can enforce sanctions. And I think here the commitment on the Russian side to continue getting those military supplies and the concerns on the US side of trying to keep Russian and other sanctioned oil on the market, I think sort of limit the degree of enforcement there. So a show of resolve from NATO. But this is also coming at a time where other U.S. allies are really saying, well, what is going to be the commitment? How will foreign policy change if there's a Trump administration? So I think there's a lot of questions of exactly, what the U.S. commitment is, but also how U.S. policy towards some of these ongoing conflicts will evolve in coming years.
Mark, I wanted to get your European perspective on that same subject. I'm trying to look at the tea leaves here at the war theater in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The bookend of this week started with that brutal missile attack on the children's hospital in Kiev. We've had this declaration by NATO and the US putting China in the kind of a line in which they haven't crossed before NATO. They've always wanted to try and keep China on side, but now they've kind of said, no, you're making this happen. And now we've had Orban in Moscow at the end of this week. We had Modi in Moscow at the beginning of the week. Where do you think, is this Ukraine thing setting up for another layer of escalation, or is all of this noise and activity a sort of a doorway into the grand bargain? What are your thoughts about where this is all going vis-a-vis Ukraine and the political sort of risk premium that it could deliver to the oil market or not?
Well, one thing well worth noting as we were talking about sanctions and trade, Europe is proving duplicitous in terms of its trade. If you actually look at the amount of the increase in trade between the EU and countries like Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, year on year, we're talking about 1,000% increases in exports, which are clearly all going to Russia. So Europe's enforcement of sanctions can at best be called lip service. There is a deep divide in Europe. On the one hand, the Central Eastern European countries, and indeed the UK. Well worth noting, there's comments yesterday from Mr. Salma that any UK missiles delivered to the Ukraine can be used to attack Russia. So they're on a fairly united front, but Western Europe really not really sure what it's doing. Symptomatic, actually, of weak governments across the board. We don't know what's going to happen in France. So there are a lot of still very divergent views in Europe. People are not, I don't think Europe is in any way looking at a grand bargain for the time being. There are absolutely no indications on that front. On the other hand, their commitment to support, when you actually look down to the brass tacks of what's being done as opposed to what's being said, I wouldn't say it's half-hearted, but it's certainly not the sort of commitment that one has, say, for instance, seen in respect of what was done with Iraq, particularly in the first Iraq war.
And of course, Putin is reading all those tea leaves, isn't he? He's not stupid to the half-heartedness of this defiance.
And indeed, he's probably more than happy that what he sees as his own divisive practices in terms of, for instance, inviting Orban to Moscow, knowing that he's got a very feel ally there. He can play on and exploit all these differences. And so he probably doesn't feel particularly threatened for the time being at all, even though, and indeed probably Poland and the Baltic states feels rather more threatened by the lack of support from Western Europe than they do, to a certain extent, the obvious threat from Russia.
Osama, I wanted to pick up with you on a very unique story, which is kind of, I think indicative of where the geopolitical advancement of China taking, some advantage of this moment. We had NATO declaring China taking advantage of the Russia invasion in Ukraine to keep the West a little bit unstable. But also in Pakistan, there are reports that Chinese investment is, whether it be in what they call the Belt Road Initiative, ports, Gwadar, and other infrastructure that the Chinese are funding, are getting attacked by militant forces in Pakistan that specifically targeting Chinese investment. This is not a welcome investment. What is the story around that? Is it amount to being a significant challenge to Chinese investment in Pakistan?
Well, certainly, in the recent few years, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, the flagship project of BRI, has come under not only a few challenges, but also scrutiny by the people and the government both. This has resulted into somewhat slowdown in the full-on or full throttle implementation of this project. Hence, we have not seen the trickle-down effects of CPEC as well. That has in turn, it's a feedback loop that has in turn further stoked doubts regarding this project. Recently, Pakistan-Chinese relationship has been a little bit shaky. We have recently asked China for a debt restructuring program. Out of the 124 billion foreign debt, around 25 billion of it we owe it to China. In terms of then there is different bifurcation of it, but if China goes on with it, so far China has not given a positive response. We might be able to save around $600 million this year in debt repayment, $580 million next year. I mean, this is a short-term thing. But the relation between China and Pakistan has certainly been affected negatively by the ongoing geopolitical developments. Another important factor in this, Sean, and it has always been the case, is you never know why and who is carrying out these attacks. You see, Pakistan as a country is going through a very tough time, both economic wise and also politically. We have rising food prices as well. There is a climate crisis. And maybe there are other elements out there that want to take advantage of this. There's a whole geopolitical military dimension to this thing. And derailing CPEC, I personally am a proponent of CPEC. I believe this would create jobs and positivity and also help resolve our energy issues. Derailing this progress might be one of the long-term goals in the greater game of geopolitics. So there's a lot going on, but certainly for the rest of the year, I will be keenly watching what happens specifically on the economic front in between China and Pakistan debt deals.
Well, it's certainly a big story, or a story to keep watching. Not only obviously the Pakistan being Exhibit A, if you like, but Chinese unwillingness to deliver debt relief in Africa is also causing a lot of unpleasant discomfort to the scale of which it differs from place to place. But it is a notable item on the list to keep an eye on China's sort of geopolitical aspirations. Let's go to the survey question this morning and get a view of the room before I want to get you guys to talk a little bit about what you'll be watching when everybody goes on holidays. So China's Communist Party Top Select Committee will meet next week for the third summit of current 5-year government. Will they greenlight any notable stimulus measures to drive growth and energy demand in the second half of 2024? So big meeting next week. Everybody's waiting. Everybody's speculating. Will this be the day that China sort of shows a big green light to the world? Yes or no? Rachel, I wanted to get your thoughts. Inevitably, this is our second last session podcast ahead of the big summer break. And I wanted to, this sort of weird, funky period, which is normally a bit weird because of the silly season, as we call it, but we have this big event in America coming. It's called the presidential election. And I don't think we've
ever already underway.
Yeah, of course. We've never seen a story quite like this one. Biden, will he, won't he be pushed, withdraw? But I want to give you your thoughts, what you'll be watching closely, most relevant for the energy markets over the holiday season, and maybe start with how big or not the Biden story is.
Yeah, I mean, I think this Biden story is a big one, right? The president has come out very strongly, that he's staying in the race, which I think maybe only adds to some of the concerns that some of those, so many have. We saw yesterday, maybe you're overnight, George Clooney and other donors coming out and raising concerns. The big story, I think, here is to what extent the administration and the campaign is focused on this element as opposed to managing the ongoing crises. Normally, in the last couple of months of a campaign, you always have the split, but there's this desire to avoid crises, to sort of deal with that, to sort of push things off, particularly to avoid crises in the energy markets. And so I do think that there's, you know, a distraction, and that is a concern. It's also coming at a time where, you know, we might see, you know, we mentioned earlier about a new Iranian government. They've put one of the elements on the table of, you know, the only way to address domestic economic challenges is to talk about sanctions. They're not going to find the U.S. a particular an interlocutor with bandwidth in the next couple of months, and they probably wouldn't like what they would get with a potential Trump administration. So I do think this sort of campaign question is going to be an issue. Also, we might well sort of see markets, not necessarily oil markets, but emerging market currencies starting to kind of price in more questions of what might the tariff outlook look like, either under a new Biden administration or a new Trump administration. So I'm watching that. And I think Mark's points about, will we see anything out of the China plenum that really sort of puts a floor under the property market? I'm not too optimistic that we'll do more than maybe some kind of a floor. I don't think the Chinese government is ready for sort of big stimulus. And so I think you're having this element on the energy markets of, you know, really waiting to see whether the demand is going to be there to justify this planned withdrawal, in a sense, of OPEC plus cuts that has been pre-announced. So I think all this is going on, and then somewhere off scene, also raising this question mark is there going to be impact on U.S. production from a more extensive hurricane season? How will that sort of play out? What about the war in Ukraine? I've gone well beyond the U.S., so I'm going to stop there.
Just to follow up, Rachel, putting beside the hurricane season, which of course, if you're on the beach, you should be watching that. But the idea of the U.S. production, regardless of hurricane season, we've seen a fairly flat U.S. The Baker Hughes rig count is at a 5-year low. Where's U.S. production going in the second half of the year, all things being equal, no hurricanes of any great significance? Should we expect it to continue to be somewhat muted through the year?
Yeah, I would say probably muted, but you know, sort of marginal gains here. The U.S., I think at the kind of price points that we're seeing, the kind of range we're at, I think this encourages more production or sort of continued investment, you know, dynamics. One of the paradoxes here is, of course, OPEC wants to be the last one standing, the last one pumping, but has been in trying to put its own floor in place, actually incentivizes other producers, not just in the U.S., but really throughout the Americas, and even places like Brazil, right, which have theoretically joined some sort of new waiting room of OPEC plus. So I think that, you know, the question mark is, of course, what's the drop off rate? So, you know, I see you know, sort of moderate additions, not big game changers, but we're seeing that in a sort of what I still see as a sluggish demand outlook.
Mark, picking up on that, I mean, we had the OPEC report out yesterday. They're holding on to their 2.2 million barrel a day demand growth for 2024. If that is to be anywhere near realized, we're going to have a raging demand in the second half. Speak to your thoughts about what you'll be watching when you're sitting on those beautiful Polish beaches.
Well, one thing to keep an eye on within Europe is the heat at the moment is getting to the point, particularly here in Poland, where refining output may have to be cut because the refineries can't operate in extreme heat. So if we carry on having hot weather, that's certainly, and that's not just a case of Poland, it's a number of countries which are affected in that way. We've got wildfires across the whole of the Mediterranean. So, you know, weather and bad weather effects and storms, definitely something very important to watch. The other thing, to me, is what we're seeing in Europe, and you're seeing in a number of other places, is EV demand is not proving as strong as people had been expecting. It's mostly a function of price. Oil demand is getting a bit of a boost from that. One shouldn't overplay it. But it is getting a boost because it's not falling as people would expect in the auto sector. And it's a trend which needs to be very, very closely watched. It's not just a matter of the politics of it. It's actually what the consumer does. And at the end of the day, that's actually very important. The other one, which we have to keep an eye on, is the deindustrialization of Germany. This morning, Volkswagen have announced that they're going to be announcing their first ever plant closure in Europe. It is an EV plant in Belgium, but it doesn't really matter. It's a sign of the times in terms of demand in Europe. And it is obviously significant that it's an EV plant rather than a normal oil-fueled engine. So it's that, and then really how the things develop in France. Where do we go from here? Can anyone really fashion a grand coalition? France doesn't have the history of Belgium, Netherlands, Austria, and indeed now Germany of fashioning these big cross the political divide coalitions. They would have to reshape something. And the situation there isn't getting any better. And as we know, the French people are prone to protest a lot of the time. And if they feel that nothing's happening, they'll probably get even more frustrated. So that political tension there is certainly the other thing. But nevertheless, it still appears that consumers are feeling, certainly my problem will be is if we have a travel-related boost to demand, how badly will it tail off going into the winter? Because I can see someone basically looking at people just wanting to get away because the news isn't fantastic at the moment. So they want to get away on their summer holidays. And then suddenly we get back to the reality of September and demand starts dropping off in Europe. And suddenly you might be in a situation where the ECB may actually have to cut rates a lot quicker than people expect them to.
Well, let's give Osama Rizvi the last word today with the survey results. Osama, what would you be watching on the holiday season that you think it could be notable and impact energy markets?
Well, I would really be watching, Sean, the fundamental indicators. For instance, despite the recent inventory withdrawals, US inventories still are 8% higher, 18 million barrels higher than 10-year seasonal average. I would also be watching the physical demand of the Chinese markets in terms of the oil, what is happening to the crude oil and water, and the flows specifically from Russia and other OPEC members, because essentially this would mean that the OPEC plus spec, which already is sort of getting under threat because recently they produced more than 200,000 barrels per day above their quota. So all of these things can lead to big developments, possibly a resurgence of a price war, as we saw back in 2014. I continue to say that because this remains one of the biggest tail risks for the oil markets and for the global economy.
I think that's a very good point, because with it is the extra piece that even if OPEC Plus proceed with their increases, their official increases in the 8 countries that have made commitments to raise output from October, and their OPEC Plus meets on August 1st, and some indicators there would it be expected that yes, we are moving ahead with the October increases, that actually that may not be as big a moment because many of those countries are already producing above their quotas, already producing at near limits. So it may not be the mega moment that it was sort of initially received as in early June when it was announced. We're going to have to leave it there. Brent crude oil at 85.68, up nearly 0.75% in trade in Asia today. A very healthy number for anybody to go on summer holidays with if you're a producer, and maybe if you're a consumer, you're not too disappointed either because they haven't hit that big 90 number that many were expecting. I want to just wrap up by thanking our amazing cast today and for their contributions throughout the season. Mark Oswald, as always, amazing insights. Osama Rizvi, thank you so much for bringing your voice from near Asia. And Rachel Ziemba, nobody better on that geopolitical intersection with the national energy outlook and all of the associated themes. Thank you, Rachel. Have a great summer break. We'll see you all back in September and hopefully in Fujairah for our annual Shenanigans forum in October 1st and 2nd. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.